used 12 agency case studies in total to capture a wide variety of types of proceedings and contexts. And then I'll sort of end by just briefly summarizing sort of how agency practices that I studied ended up being categorized in the report. I ended up using 7 distinct practices as categories for agency design choices. So the first practice is when agencies themselves gather federal records necessary for a proceeding, either by pulling from their own records or from the records of other agencies that are necessary to pre-populate a file, a proceeding file with information. And this strategy is, of course, most burdensome for the agency and tends to be particularly well deployed in instances where the agency is in a position to help private parties apply for benefits to which they're entitled. The remainder of agency practices fall more on the disclosure side. Agencies deploy, of course, very formal administrative discovery mechanisms. They engage in informal information disclosures from the relevant agency official. They provide access to records through online portals or logins. They make proactive disclosures related to proceedings or have a fully public docket. They rely on private parties' rights under FOIA to access their records, or sometimes provide a non-FOIA request option. So the report details the considerations that lead agencies to choose one practice over another and forms the basis for many of the recommendations that you see today about how agencies should approach these procedural design questions. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you again to everyone involved in this project, and I'm happy to answer questions at any point.
Thank you very much. Let's turn now to Erica.
All right. Thank you very much to everyone and to the committee, which put in a lot of good work on this. The committee met twice. We met on September 15th, and then because of the shutdown, our second meeting was not until December 8th. As normal, Margaret presented her work at the first meeting, and then we deliberated on the draft recommendation put together for us by the ACA staff. We finished the recommendation and the report in our first meeting, which gave us a chance to sort of let it percolate before we reconvened in December. What I thought I would do in the sort of 2 minutes that I have is just identify the primary thing that we spent a lot of our time focusing on. So we spent most of our time working on paragraph 1 and then the language that appears in paragraphs 7 and 8, and a fair amount of the discussion related to the scope of the recommendation as it relates to one agency making records available to another agency. And it was there was a change in the drafting and evolution because of the committee's view that we should separate out sharing records within the agency itself, sharing records with private parties, and sharing records with other agencies. And the limitation that the records be not only relevant but needed for use was viewed as quite important. We had a fairly lengthy discussion about limiting interagency sharing of records to those that are needed for use in determining eligibility for benefits or services. And that limitation is specific to the interagency sharing. That aligned with what was the focus, not the sole discussion, but really most of what I in my view, is the focus of the consultant's report. And I think importantly, it avoided concerns about the possibility that records gathered for one purpose might not actually be fit for use for a fundamentally different purpose. And those discussions then informed the drafting of paragraphs 7 and 8, which of course relate to interagency agreements when this sort of information sharing is regularly needed, and which the committee thought should actually reflect a consultation to determine fitness for the purposes for which the information would be used, as well as the factors that might be relevant to that inquiry. So that was most of our discussion was around paragraphs 1 and 7 and 8. And I think the committee did a lot of hard work and a lot of careful consideration of those. And we look forward to hearing the discussion as we move forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. First order of business is to consider the manager's amendments. These amendments consist of non-substantive revisions. They're highlighted in yellow on the red line recommendations in your materials. Is there any objection to adopting the manager's amendments? Hearing none, I will declare them adopted by unanimous consent. Before we begin consideration of pre-submitted amendments, does any member seek recognition for the purpose of general discussion on the recommendation? Hearing none and having no council amendments, we'll turn now to the pre-submitted amendments. We have two pre-submitted amendments. Let me turn to the first one by Bernard Bell. It applies to lines 66 to 70 and amends paragraph 1. Bernie, would you like to explain this amendment?
Yes, thank you, Ron. I was a member of the committee, and I actually want to thank Erica for her leadership and Margaret for her great work on the consultant's report. This amendment focuses on recommendation 1, which essentially says that unless something's prohibited by law or permitted by an exception, allowing for withholding of records, uh, that there's a presumption that materials should be made available to 3 different groups of people. And the intent of this amendment is basically to clarify some ambiguities, to lend some precision to the committee's recommendation. I don't view this as a major substantive change in the recommendation, but I'll leave it to Erica or Margaret to comment on that. So what the amendment does first is the proviso about unless prohibited by law or permitted by an exception is moved from the end of recommendation 1 to the beginning so that it's clear that it applies to actually all 3 groups, A, internal distribution, B, interagency distribution, and C, to the public. As it is now, it could be read to apply only to interagency distribution. Second, just to make it more readable, I've suggested splitting the provision into subsections to deal with each of these separate groups separately. So that's kind of the second major thing that's been done with this. The third is it seems to me implicit in talking about eligibility for benefits. We're also talking about ineligibility for benefits as well. If the agency wants to withdraw benefits from someone, they should also proactively provide the materials needed for the person to defend against that, as well as the level of benefits. So um, the level of benefits to which someone is entitled, I think, is inevitably wrapped up with the eligibility question. So this is designed to just make that explicit. Um, um, and I said to kind of keep this short, a couple of the other major amendments or major revisions here are designed to recognize that sometimes people need to get information before they decide to seek benefits. That is often the case in the immigration context. And there's language that kind of teases that out and makes that more explicit, and that documents should be provided in that context. And finally, it just clarifies that with regard to the public in general, agency legal materials, materials that say what the law is, should be made publicly available as possible, regardless of whether the person seeking it is participating in the particular proceeding at issue. So there's a lot kind of going on here. I don't know how you want to address it as far as whether you want to go through point by point or try to do it as a whole. But that's the basic gist of what I'm trying to accomplish here.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Bernie. Thank you. Let me turn first to Erica to see if you have any response or reaction on behalf of the committee.
Um, my my reaction actually is that I view this as fully consistent with what the committee was doing. I think the separation of the three groups, if you will, was embedded in the sentence before, but not nearly as clearly as this amendment proposes. And so I guess my view would be that this is consistent, I believe, with what the committee was trying to do, and not a substantive change.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I will ask that this also be adopted by unanimous consent if there is no objection. And hearing none, thank you, Bernie. The amendment is adopted. Let me turn now to the second proposed amendment from Special Counsel Jeff Lovers. It appears in lines 69 and 93 and suggests adding licenses and permits after benefit and services in both places in accordance with the language that appears in the preamble. Jeff, would you like to discuss this, add anything to it? Jeff doesn't want to add anything.
I think he's having trouble joining. I think something about an
He should never have trouble joining us.
AOL outage.
But we'll wait just a minute and see if Jeff needs to get on to add something. As a very valued member and former director of research and everything else. Again, let me turn to Erica and see if she has anything to add or say.
No, I don't. I went back through the transcripts from our meetings, and I don't think we talked about this. So it might be interesting, actually, if there's a moment to hear Margaret on this. But I don't think we actually even talked about the lack of symmetry between the preamble language and the recommendation on this very point. It's not obvious to me that this is inconsistent with benefits and services, it sort of conceptually, but I don't think we talked about it. So I think some discussion is probably warranted.
Any response? Okay. So Bernie, you wanted to be recognized on this?
Yes, sorry. Yes, I did. Thank you. Actually, as I recall the second meeting, this did come up, and we discussed whether this proposal would include licensing proceedings. And as I recall, we asked Margaret whether her case studies included licensing proceedings, and she said that they did, but that in general, licensing proceedings involve parties that were more sophisticated, and that the proceedings in general were more formalized, and so therefore it wasn't clear that this presumption in recommendation one should apply in the same manner. So I think that was the committee's thinking, that we were at least chary about applying something in the licensing context that was really designed for the benefits context. That being said, I think a lot of these recommendations, I don't know about recommendation one in particular, but a lot of them I think would apply to licensing proceedings, and licensing proceedings would benefit from some of these procedures as well. But I just don't know that we want to, in a plenary session, go through each recommendation and figure out which one applies well to licensing and which doesn't. But that's my memory of the discussion.
Thank you, Bernie. Let me turn to Jeff now, who I think is online. Jeff speaking very quietly. While Jeff is speaking quietly, Margaret, do you want to be recognized on this?
Yes, thank you. Bernie's exactly right that, I think I think Erica's right that we decided sort of in the committee not to address this, in part based on the fact that despite having canvassed a wide variety of agency types of proceedings, only a couple of examples of licensing, the one that comes to mind most in the foreground is at FERC, were examined in the report, and that at the end of the day, I didn't feel like the research supported a recommendation one way or the other, because licensing is so specialized as a categorical matter, and I didn't have sort of enough breadth of examples of licensing practices to come up with an affirmative recommendation about how to treat records in that instance. That's not to say that I think, obviously the expertise in the virtual room right now might support a recommendation to add that, and I think that would be, could be potentially perfectly appropriate. Just that the report itself didn't have enough evidence for us to make an affirmative recommendation after having canvassed the agency practices that I did. So I think Bernie's characterization is right. I just wanted to sort of reaffirm that's also my view.
Thank you.
Hello, Ron. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You want to go, and
Okay.
then we'll go to Erica after you. Nice,
Thank
Jeff.
you. Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't access the plenary session through my computer, so I had to do it through my phone for the first time, and I just accessed it when you were in the middle of this. In fact, before I say anything, could someone on the staff please send me the link through a different email, jlubbers@american.edu, and then I can access it on my computer. For some reason, there's an AOL problem. Anyway, the reason that I made this recommendation or this suggestion was just for consistency's sake. It's not really a substantive thing. I just noticed that at one part of the recommendation, it did include all the categories, and then in other parts it did not. So I defer to Erica if there's some substantive reason for not doing it. It just seemed inconsistent to me.
I will say, Jeff, you look much taller over the phone.
Well, I can't even see myself on the phone, so I don't know.
Erica, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of wrap it together at this point, because, and what Jeff said is actually really helpful. We did the focus on benefits and services was very much, as Margaret says, because that was the focus of the report. And what I don't recall any discussion of, and Bernie may, but I don't recall any discussion of the asymmetry that Jeff is focused on. In other words, the language in the preamble actually including the permits and licensing, and the paragraph 1 not doing so. And it seems to me if the genesis of the comment is they don't match, then it may make more sense to just fix it at the preamble level rather than changing the scope of the recommendation.
Thank you very much. Before we continue discussion, to have this motion adopted would require that a voting member advance a recommendation that we do that, or a proposal that we do that. Do I hear any voting member who wants to take up Jeff's amendment?
I'll do it. Alice Codmeyer.
Okay. That is then on the floor. Bernie, you had something else you wanted to add?
Yes, thank you. My memory of the meeting was that we noticed this difference, and I think the way we resolved it was that the reference in the preamble is with regard to an empirical matter. As an empirical matter, there's vast amounts of proceedings on all of these things, including licensing and permits, that require information. But that recommendation 1 is prescriptive. It's not merely empirical. And so I believe we thought it was appropriate to make the empirical observation starting out, which is accurate, but then to say, as far as our recommendation, that we wanted to limit it to the benefits context and not talk about licensing and permits. But I mean, it wouldn't do any major damage to remove licensing and permits from the preamble. Um, Although I think the statement in the preamble is actually accurate, as a matter of fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Any further discussion? Hearing none, let me ask that we have this one voted on by yays and nays. All those who are in favor of the amendment say yay, and you need to actually turn on your voice. All those in favor say yay.
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 All those opposed say nay.
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 I think the nays have it, at least by volume, if not by number. If there is no notion to the contrary, we will move on and ask if there are any additional proposed amendments. Hearing none. Hearing one.
Peter Strauss has his hand up.
Peter?
You're muted, Peter.
Oh, okay. I don't think you should do this on the basis of volume. It's possible for anyone to raise or lower their hand, and you can make counts in that way. From my perspective, I can't think of a reason why the documents and licensing and permit proceedings, which are generally public proceedings, should not be available.
There's been a request to do this by hand raising. It seemed to me it was pretty off by the proposal. We can do it by a show of hands. What's our procedure here?
All those in favor,
Oh.
your hand raised feature.
So all those who are in favor, raise your hand. Count you. And all those opposed? So the nays have it on this by number, not just by volume. Are there any additional proposed amendments? Hearing none, we'll proceed to a final vote. Is there a motion to adopt the recommendation as amended? All those in favor of adopting the recommendation, say yay.
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 All those opposed, nay. The yeas have it. Congratulations to the committee. Thank you to our consultant as well. And Ale, thank you for your help on that too. Our second recommendation of the day is temporary rules, which comes to us from the Committee on Rulemaking. And I'd like to thank Chair Jennifer Dickey, in-house researcher, so Ale, you have to stay here, and Staff Counsel Ben Burkham. We'll hear from Ale first on the report, and then from Jennifer on the committee's proceeding. Ale, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ron. Hi, everyone. I'm Ayalari Perdes, and I'm an attorney advisor here at ACUS, and have been working as an in-house researcher on this report on temporary rules for the past year. This has been very much a collaborative effort, and I especially want to thank Ben and Jeremy from the ACUS staff who provided incredible guidance, and to all ACUS members and agency officials who offered insights at various stages of this project. I also want to thank the members of the Committee on Rulemaking and the committee chair, Jen Dickey, for their helpful comments that assisted finalize this report. My comments today are going to be relatively short. The report was developed to identify best practices for how agencies use temporary rules. We wanted to understand, when do agencies use them, what factors guide those decisions, how does the Office of the Federal Register process temporary rules, and how do agencies engage with the public in that process? Our methodology combines several approaches: a review of the historical and doctrinal foundations of temporary rulemaking, interviews with agency officials, 7 case studies, a search in the Federal Register, and finally, a survey of statutory provisions authorizing temporary rules across all 50 states. A key issue for the study was definitional. Temporary rules are used in different ways by different entities, and for the purposes of this report, we identify temporary rules as legislative rules that include an expiration date, whether that date is specified calendar date or conditioned upon a specific future event. While this definition is broader than some of the traditional uses of the term, we adopted it because all those rules captured by it share an underlying feature. They allow the agency to effectively undertake 2 regulatory actions in one, to both promulgate the rule and repealing it at the same time. This dual action requires the agency to provide not only a reasoned explanation for the substance of the rule, but also for its limited duration. Based on this definition, we identify 3 main circumstances that when temporary rules are used. First, for deviating from the traditional regulatory framework, both in emergency and non-emergency contexts. Second, for regulatory learning, which includes things like periodic rulemaking, mandated retrospective review, and pilot programs. And finally, for adjusting to legal changes, most commonly following a new legislation or a court ruling. I look forward to the discussion here today, and please feel free to reach out if you have any thoughts or comments on the report. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ron.
Thank you, Ale. Let me ask Jennifer Dickey, if you want, who is our committee chair, if you want to add to what Ale has said or report anything on the discussions of the committee.
Sure, thank you. IL's report was really eye-opening. I had not thought about temporary rules from a sort of holistic perspective before this report. And I thought he did a great job of identifying the myriad circumstances in which these are or could be used and the benefits to the public that would pertain from a more consistent governmental approach to such rules. During the deliberations, which were split up by the government shutdown, the committee considered a number of issues, including when these rules should be published in an electronic CFR versus a print version of the CFR, how they could be more clearly designated as temporary for the reviewing public, and how to address rules that have a prescribed end time, but where the calendar date is unknown, like, the end of the COVID pandemic. The committee also deliberated on the factors we thought agencies should consider in deciding whether to issue a temporary rule, how to balance the possibility of an agency binding itself to an expenditure of resources that it didn't end up having, and the extent to which we should address general sunset provisions. In the end, we decided to be silent on general sunset provisions and focus on this subset of rules where we thought the benefits and drawbacks could be clearly defined in a recommendation of this sort.
Thank you. Let me turn now to general discussion. And I have a requirement to recognize Jack Bierman, not just because he had his hand up, but also because he's a co-author.
Okay, well, thank you, Ron. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
My question about this generally had to do with the second reason that agencies use temporary rules. And, when I did the report on midnight rulemaking, I discovered that there are, probably hundreds. I mean, I didn't look at hundreds, but probably hundreds of situations in which agencies have to update their rules every year. And that much of the midnight rulemaking was just to get that done before the end of the term. And I just have a question whether the temporary rules label really fits that. That is, if an agency has to do something every year, like set a certain limit, set a certain catch amount, let's say for a fishery, or set a certain timber cutting for a forest under management. I'm not sure that really fits into the general category of temporary rules that this recommendation is concerned about. And I just was interested in hearing if people thought, if this was discussed at the committee. I imagine it was, but so that was just my thought about it. I thought I would share with the group.
Thanks, Jack. Let me turn first to Jennifer to ask if you have a reaction or response.
I mean, I think we did discuss regulatory learning as a reason that agencies engage in this.
Excuse me, this isn't about learning. It's about requirements of annual updating that exist in many, many statutes.
Oh, yeah, we thought that was also a reason to do it. Like we went through all of these factors and thought that all of those were good reasons for agencies to clearly delineate this rule is only going to be in place for so long, to make it clear to the public and also to encourage them to follow with their annual updates.
Is your point, Jack, that these rules that are just updates should be treated differently from the other things that go into the temporary rules category?
I mean, they seem really different from some temporary rules. When I think of temporary rules, I think of a rule that is, for example, a rule that's promulgated in an emergency situation or a pressing situation where there's going to be further consideration for a permanent rule, or in reaction to an emergency or something like that. Whereas this seems to be just a regular feature of our regulatory system, that there are certain things that just by statute or by practice have to be updated, because the whole rulemaking is key to situations that change year by year, whether it's because of changed conditions or changed policies. So, I mean, I'm not really saying anything. I just wanted to make sure that the people felt comfortable that the treatment of these kinds of rules, along with these other sort of temporary rules, made sense. That's all.
Thank you, Jack. AL, did you have a reaction?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and I think we added periodic rulemaking and throughout the research we identified that a lot of the questions about temporary rulemaking are relevant for periodic rulemaking as well. First of all, the fact that there is an expiration date and the agency needs to adjust to that expiration date, make sure that they're doing the full rulemaking and review process before that specific expiration date hits. Some of the periodic rules do have provisions to handle situations where the rule is expired before they manage to create a new annual rule or biannual rule or whatever that period is. And a lot of the different factors and consideration that agencies need to have when they're pursuing temporary rules are applicable for periodic rule making as well. I think this is why in the research in my report, we decided to include them in the report as part of temporary rulemaking. They seem to fit both the category of regulatory learning and to the actions of agencies with other temporary rulemaking.
Thank you, Ayo. Jen, did you have another comment on
Yeah.
this?
So a lot of what the committee was focused on is like clarity for the regulatory public. Like when you have a temporary rule, it can be marked as like provision/T in the like CFR, and it's like it may be published only in the electronic CFR versus the print CFR. And like, how is it clear to the public so that when they pull up a rule, they know whether the rule is like expired or still in effect? And I think all of those like just like clarity considerations are like equally applicable to ones that have annual updates. Like if you see an annual update that says like 2025 update, but it doesn't clearly indicate, and this is only good for 2025, then the public doesn't know that like there might be a new rulemaking out there it needs to go look for. And so that those were sort of the transparency goals that the committee was interested in. And I think that fits neatly within here. And so a lot of this is like focused more on the administrative aspects of temporary rules, I think, than like the substantive choices about like, you know, which rule should be. It's focused on like, how do we make sure that these are consistent so people know that the rule is in effect or is not in effect.
Thank you. Let me turn at this point to the manager's amendment. This is the first order of business as typical. And the manager's amendment consists, as always, of non-substantive revisions. They're highlighted in yellow on the red line version in your packets. Is there any objection to adopting the manager's amendment? Hearing no objection, they're adopted. Is there any general discussion? We have. So, Peter?
Just following up on Jack's comment and accepting that required temporary rules are appropriately part of this recommendation. I wonder whether the first recommendation ought not to be amended to indicate that it applies in circumstances where not only does the agency determine or reasonably expect that a rule will only be necessary for a limited time, it should consider issuing a temporary rule, but some language to suggest that when it's required to issue periodic rules, these recommendations apply.
Let me hold that thought, Peter, for when we get to further amendments after we do the pre-submitted amendments. Any other general discussion? Let's move on to the pre-submitted amendments. There is no set of council proposed amendments to the recommendation, but there are 3 pre-submitted conference member amendments. So let me turn first to Bernard Bell. Bernie, you had a proposed amendment?
Sure. You recognize me for the first amendment on the wording temporary rules?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So this is, I realize it's kind of late in the day to be changing the whole title of the project, but I mean, it seems to me that ACUS and others are using temporary rules in to have various different meanings. And the term temporary rules itself seems to suggest something that's fairly short term. And as I understand it, what we're really talking about is simply rules that are not indefinite. And thus we could be talking about a rule that could be designed to last for 10 years, let's say. And it strikes me as odd to talk about that sort of rule as a temporary rule. So my suggestion would be to use a different term for what we're talking about, something like temporally limited rules, which I think more fits what we're talking about in terms of the possible length and being a distinct term that's not a term that ACUS has used for another purpose in a previous report, as noted in footnote 2, or that the Federal Register has used for some other set of rules they describe as temporary. So if that change is made, then clearly it would have to be made throughout the report or the recommendation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Ale, you want to react to that?
Yes, thank you for the comment, Bernie. I do think the temporary rules capture the term is useful here and capture what we intended to say in this recommendation. What the type of rules that we are addressing this recommendation in this report has referred as temporary rules by the agencies themselves, as you can see from the several case studies that are laid out in this report. And I do think that they have an underlying feature that the agencies promulgate and repeal the rule with the same regulatory action. And I think the temporary rulemaking is an intuitive way to capture this, as well as something that is well used with other agencies. And because there are several different instances when entities use temporary rules differently, I do think that this report and this recommendation can be useful in creating a uniform terminology that might be helpful.
Thank you, Ale. Jen, did you want to add something on this?
Yeah, originally in the proposed recommendation, there were like a couple different formulations used, like temporary rules and also like rules of like a defined duration or some, I forget exactly what the original formulation was. And the committee preferred temporary rules because, a lot of times these are like sort of there's no calendar date, but it's like we know it's temporary because it's going to end when the COVID pandemic ends, but we don't know when the COVID pandemic is going to end. And so we thought like rules that are like temporally limited or time limited duration might suggest more like a date as opposed to like a specific event. And so we thought temporary rules more adequately kind of captured the full range of what we were talking about.
Thank you. Any other discussion on this matter? Let me ask people to do the ayes and yays and nays. All those in favor, yay. All those opposed, nay.
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 I think the nays have it on this one. Let me turn to proposed amendment 2, which is also from Bernie. It applies to 1D, line 100 in the clean version of the recommendation, and would add the phrase "or would benefit from" to recognize that agencies consider issuing a temporary rule both when the rule requires updating and when the rule would benefit from updating on a periodic basis. Bernie, and any you want to add to that?
Well, just a little bit. I think actually this is the answer to Peter's question, actually, because this is where it talks about required updating. But as far as the amendment, I think it kind of speaks for itself. So I'll leave it at that.
Let me turn first to Jen. Anything you want to say on the committee's behalf?
I think that that would be fine and consistent with what the committee deliberated on. I think we thought that if an agency was like going to commit itself to an expenditure of resources, it might be or like it might be appropriate to commit itself through a sort of temporary rule. I think because it says, you know, circumstances in which it may be appropriate, it's not suggesting his edit is not suggesting that agencies will always have to issue a temporary rule if they think it would benefit from annual reporting, but just that it might be appropriate if they think it would. So I think that's fine.
Any contrary views or people satisfied? Let me ask for unanimous consent on this. Is there any objection? No objection. The amendment is adopted. The third proposed amendment is also from Bernie. And this applies to paragraph 3, starting at line 110, the clean version of the recommendation. And it would modify the paragraph to distinguish between procedural and substantive factors that agencies should consider when designating a rule as temporary, as well as 2 additional substantive factors at the end of the paragraph for agencies to consider. Bernie, you want to add anything to the reason for the proposed amendment?
Sure, I'll add a little bit here. It seemed to me that from the report, I mean, the report, I think, discusses some policy reasons or substantive factors why agencies might or might not want to use temporary rules. And what I think I gathered from the report was kind of the fluidity of the circumstances. Agencies might want to consider temporary rules when circumstances are fluid, as well as when the agency doesn't have a sufficient knowledge base to promulgate a permanent rule. And it seemed to me that if we were discussing in recommendation 3, the agency's decision as far as whether or not to use temporary rules, then not only what I would call the administrative factors, which are listed, should be considered, but also the learning from the report with regard to some of the policy considerations. So I'm sure the committee and IO could probably do a much better job at filling out the substantive considerations, but this was my attempt at least to get down what I saw as some of the policy considerations coming out of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Let me turn first to Jen to get her reaction from the standpoint of the committee.
Thanks, Bernie. So we spent a lot of time on paragraphs 1 and 2 as trying to outline some of the substantive reasons an agency would consider doing a rulemaking. Like we viewed 1 and 2 as the substantive. Like 1 is like it's an emergency, finite duration, you're required. 2 is regulatory learning. And then 3 is more like the benefits from like designating it as temporary. Like, so we viewed 3 as more administrative and the substance as like in 1 and 2. And so these additions, I think, maybe undercut a little bit of what we were doing in paragraphs 1 and 2. And so I guess I would probably not be in favor of adding them because I think 1 and 2 really lays out the main circumstances from the preamble about when a temporary rule would be appropriate.
Thank you, Jen. Let me ask AL if you have any further reaction.
I have only one reaction that I'm not sure that I completely understand the distinction between administrative and substantive factors. I think some of the things that are labeled now as administrative by the amendment could all be substantive. So I'm not sure if that's a helpful distinction with my understanding of our findings in the report.
Thank you. We have further discussion on this. Let me recognize first Jack Bierman.
Yeah, I want to just echo the last comment. I mean, B, C, and F in the what's labeled now as administrative factors are to me just as substantive as A and B under substantive factors. So I don't think I think it's probably okay as long as it's okay with the people who did the research here to add A and B under substantive, but I would take out the changes that talk about administrative, that differentiate between administrative and substantive factors. And I would just have a list of factors and just have A and B under substantive be G and H. They don't seem to be different in kind from, at least from B, C, and F under administrative factors. In fact, they seem very similar.
Let me recognize Bernie next.
Thank you. So I have a question, and I'm actually prepared to withdraw this suggestion, but let me follow up on the question first, which is, it seems to me that the fluidity of the situation that the agency is trying to regulate is relevant in terms of whether you would seek a temporary rule. Is there anything that the committee believes is in recommendations 1 or 2 that will cover the fluidity of the situation that you're trying to regulate? Because I don't think I saw it. And if there is something in 1 or 2, can you point me to where that's incorporated?
Yeah, sorry.
Jen?
So I would view that as incorporated in a lot of A, B, and C. Like if it's an emergency, if it's a condition of finite duration, or if the agency is responding temporarily while it develops a more permanent approach, like all of 3 of those things seem to me to go to the fluidity of a situation. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding like what you're conceiving of that is a fluid situation that wouldn't be captured by one of those 3.
So for instance, you're trying to regulate AI. It's not necessarily an emergency. It's not necessarily something of finite duration, but it's at a nascent stage where things are changing too quickly, or maybe changing too quickly, that you feel comfortable doing an indefinite rule as opposed to doing a rule that you say, okay, this is a rule for the next 3 years, and we'll evaluate as things settle down with regard to this new developing industry. I don't think, it doesn't seem to me that A, B, C, or D really kind of get at that example.
I think then we would look to 2, because in that circumstance, it's really more like the agency is still learning about AI. And so it might be like a form of regulatory experimentation, or just seeking to, I mean, B is probably retrospective review, probably not, although maybe they are, but I would think of it as like a form of regulatory experimentation.
Let me just ask Jen, was there attention given to separating substantive from administrative factors, and what would be advanced by that, or what sort of change would be work that the committee may have discussed?
The committee spent a lot of time on like 1 and 2. I think less time on 3. I think we all viewed that as like it followed once you had these factors about sort of when a temporary rule might be appropriate, then considering whether to designate it as temporary. And like if those factors focus more on like a little bit from the agency's perspective, I think.
Thank you.
So Ron, could I be recognized to withdraw?
Yeah, yes, Bernie.
So yes, I withdraw the proposal, but I just express the concern that I'm not sure 1 and 2 quite deal with the situation where you've got something that's developing, and the agency is not regulating it on an experimental basis, but nevertheless, the agency might want to not set a rule in stone before things clear up as far as the development of that segment of the economy or that industry. But I withdraw.
Thank you, Bernie. Are there any other amendments? So, Mary Spencer requested recognition.
Yeah, good morning, all. I wanted to ask a question about how temporary rules or for experimentation and retrospective review, if there was consideration of sunsetting or putting in, how this relates to sunset provisions, and because we all have the executive order on sunsetting, and if there was thought about that.
Let me ask Jen first and then AL on that.
Yeah, we had some discussion about this. Initially, there was a footnote that kind of said some, like HHS had adopted a broad sunset provision. There was the executive order. ACUS has not previously taken a position on whether general like sunset provisions were a good thing. And after sort of debate with the committee, and we actually also had a member of the public submit comments on this, we ended up deciding that the better course of valor was to be silent, because the report didn't really grapple with like a broad-based approach to always having sunset provisions and the costs that might be associated with it. And so we just didn't feel like we had enough learning to be able to make a general statement about whether a broad sunset provision was good or bad. So we ended up deleting that footnote and just like remaining generally silent on it. And because like ACUS has supported retrospective review, so we continued that, but we didn't want to take a position on the sort of executive order or anything like that.
Thank you. Dale, did you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that's accurate.
Peter Strauss?
Well, I think this is echoing Jack's comment at the very beginning. The recommendation as a whole, which seems to me extremely sound, is worded as if always the agency is deciding whether to issue a temporary rule, despite what the language that's in 1D. And so as a matter of style, it seems to me there ought to be something, at least in the preamble, that says where agencies are required to act temporarily. These recommendations apply to the extent that seems relevant.
We did not discuss that extensively in the committee. My one concern would just be, a regulatory vacuum. Like if the agency is required to do annual updates and it doesn't do them, does the temporary rule expires, it's no longer in effect, then there's like nothing. And I know, for example, like agencies do inflation adjustments of fees, that like max fees that people are allowed to charge. And so if the rule is designated as temporary, then my understanding from our discussions is like OCR will like remove it or from the like Federal Register once it's like expired. And so then I would be concerned that people would not know what is in effect. And, it is temporary, and then there's just like a regulatory vacuum. So that is my one concern.
Well, I don't suppose it's the case that rules that are required to be adopted annually shouldn't say in the rule that this is the rule for 2017 and don't naturally expire. So that, yes, it's certainly true there'll be a vacuum on occasion because the agency is lazy or sloppy or whatever, distracted by other things. But I don't think that's a reason not to say something about the difference between rules that are required to be adopted annually and situations in which the agency decides to do so, because it isn't an agency decision. It's a statutory requirement.
Thank you, Peter. Let me ask Jack Bierman. I think you wanted to be recognized on this.
Yes, thanks. This is, the tenor of my original comment, which Peter has picked up on, is that the whole recommendation seems to be about situations in which an agency in its discretion, for some reason, decides to issue a temporary rule, where my point was that as a factual matter, there are hundreds of situations in which agencies are required to promulgate rules that only last for a particular fiscal year or a designated time period. So one way to take care of this would just be to have a footnote saying this is not about those rules at all. That this recommendation is not about situations in which statutes require that rules be issued for a finite period, like, for example, every year or every other year. Barring that, if the recommendation really wants to cover all that, then I think it probably needs a bunch of work. I mean, just looking at the first sentence in recommendation 1, if an agency determines or reasonably expects, you'd have to add, I think Peter's original comment was he was sort of thinking about an amendment to say, or if statutes require that a rule be issued for a finite period of time, then you'd have to have a different set factors. Other A, B, C, and D don't capture that situation. So I'm afraid that although it seems like the answer to my original point was that it was meaning to cover those, it really doesn't, and that creates it just seems to me that maybe the simplest way would be to footnote it out of the recommendation or something.
Ale?
Yes, I do think that at least the findings in the report support that the recommendation are applicable to temporary rules that are required to be issued as temporary. There are other circumstances beside periodic rules where statutory language requires agency to issue temporary rulemaking. I think the most prominent example is when there is adjustment periods after a legislative change, where the statute itself requires agencies to issue a temporary rule for the transition period between two regulatory regimes. So I do think that adding language stating that the recommendation is applicable for times that agencies are required to issue temporary rules would be consistent with the findings of the report.
Thank you, Ale. Jen, did you want to add for that before I go to Ron Levitt?
Yeah, I mean, I think when an agency is faced with, like, say, at the beginning of one of these processes where they're required to engage in rulemaking, there may be reasons that, like, for the first one, even though they expect it to be annually updated, they want to just do it indefinitely just so that they don't end up in a regulatory vacuum. Agencies are forever missing statutory deadlines. So, like, I think that a lot of what is in here makes sense for, like, an agency to be considering whether they should designate it as temporary, because they should be designating it as temporary. But there are also reasons that an agency would not want to designate all of them as temporary because of the regulatory vacuum. But the committee did not spend a lot of time discussing this. So,
Levin?
Yeah, Ron Levin, senior fellow. I want to at least make an argument for doing nothing about Jack's issue, because it's not as though that whole area has been overlooked. In addition to paragraph 1D in the recommendation, there is the language in the preamble that was in the clean copy, lines 35 to 38, which said agencies use temporary rules to amend rules that they must update on an annual, biennial, or other recurring basis as mandated by law, for example, EPA. So in that context, I think the question that Jack is ultimately raising is, do we need to spell that out in the provision that says, in deciding whether to issue a temporary rule, do the following? And yes, if you wanted to be really literal here, you would say, if they have a choice, they should consider the following factors and the like. To me, that is pretty much self-evident. An agency is not going to read the paragraph about what decision to make if they know it's required by law, and ACUS has acknowledged that there are such situations. I mean, I don't have, it wouldn't be terrible to add some extra words to that effect, but to me, it is so clearly something that you could infer that I don't think you need to spell it out.
Thank you, Ron. Jack Bierman, you had your hand up.
That was, I mean, obviously my whole comment was provoked by the fact that it's discussed in the preamble, but I don't think it's actually reflected in the recommendations adequately. And maybe it would be taken care of just as simple as possible. And I'm a senior fellow, so I can't offer an amendment, but in 1D, where it says when the rule requires or would benefit from, maybe the idea is to say when a statute requires or a rule requires or would benefit from updating. Because, I mean, I think we at least want to, I mean, I understand Ron is saying that, I agree with Ron's point that most of the recommendation would be helpful for rules that are statutorily required to be periodically updated. I just want to make it clear, it's not a question of the agency cannot promulgate a permanent rule in case of a regulatory vacuum in many of these situations. The statute says that the agency has to set the annual limit on something each year. The prior year's limit is expired by its own operation of law. There's got to be a regulatory vacuum if it's not updated, which is why you see so many of these done at the last minute. That's how I found so many of them in my report on midnight rulemaking. So this is not a situation where the agency could have an old rule just remain in effect. If the statute actually clearly requires that there be a new rule for each of whatever the time period is specified, the old rule just on its own weight just expires.
Let me ask Jen first to respond. Would the committee be amenable to inserting that language, or would the committee be opposed?
I think we could say when a statute or the rule requires or would benefit from updating. I disagree with Jack that like rules always expire, even if a statute says they're like an annual rule, because like I said, statutes require inflation adjustments. And if an inflation adjustment is not made, the previous year's inflation adjustment is the rule that governs, is the law that governs. So I don't think that they just like necessarily expire, but I think that indicating that it would be appropriate if a statute requires to be updated is perfectly fine.
So you would be comfortable with the language on behalf of the committee that says when a statute requires or the rule requires or would benefit from.
Are we keeping the rule requires or are we just leaving when a statute requires or the rule would benefit from? Because you just said requires or, but the text on the screen deleted the second requires.
I see what the screen says. I thought I understood Jack's proposal to keep the word requires or would benefit from in there because it covers something that is separate from statutory requirements. It could be a requirement of a rule that's not in the statute, if I understood Jack's proposal. Let me ask Jack if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking for.
And again, is that acceptable committee, Jen? If not, we'll need a proposed amendment. We have none on the floor right now from a voting member.
I think that would be acceptable to the committee.
Let me ask that that be accepted by unanimous consent then? Hearing no objections, that is accepted. Miriam Vincent, I think your hand was up on a different point.
Yeah, sorry. I do have a motion to fix a footnote that I hope is very fast and very non-substantive. Footnote 15 regarding when we update the ECFR. The last sentence here, it says, if the rule's duration is at least 3 days but less than 1 year, it will appear in the ECFR. That's not correct. Right now it's 7 days. We might be moving to 30 days. We don't know. I would suggest we say is at least a few days, rather, and not specify exactly how many days. And that, because right now it's the policy is still under discussion. So at least a few is my recommendation.
Would you be comfortable with several instead of a few?
Sure.
There a reaction, Jen, from the committee?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine. We want to be accurate. We were under the impression it was 3 days, but if it's currently 7 days and it's fluid, I think that's fine.
Is there any discussion or objection? Hearing none, we will declare that accepted by unanimous consent. Are there any other proposed amendments? Hearing none, we'll move to a vote. Is there a motion to adopt the committee's recommendations?
So move.
Thank you. Is there any objection? Are we prepared to do this by unanimous consent? Hearing no objection, the recommendations are adopted. Thank you to both our committee chair and consultants, and really appreciate the work you put in on all of this. Let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back and hear from Jeremy Grayboys about the research agenda for the conference. We'll be back at 5 after 11. So.
They were.
Oh, okay.
Both of them.
Okay, that's okay.
So far, so good.
Mr. Grayboyes, this is Sharon, the reporter.
Hi there.
Hi, can you give me the name of the gentleman who's chairing our?
Sure, that's Ronald Cass,
Thank you.
CASS.
Ronald, thank you.
You're
I'm
welcome.
trying very hard to get to do the documents to get the spellings. As long as I'm picking on you, do you know Mary's last name? I didn't hear it. I only heard him say Mary.
That would be Spencer.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, sir. Thank
Absolutely.
you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for your work today.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You too. So we are back in session. Let me turn to our Director of Research, Jeremy Grayboys, for an update on ACUS's research agenda. Jeremy?
Wonderful. Thanks, Ron. Good afternoon, all. And first off, thank you to the committee chairs, members, staff, and consultants, without whom today would not have been possible. Thanks to Ron for once again presiding over today's especially efficient session. And thanks in particular to Deputy Research Director Kaja Novatsky, who is doing an exceptional job running the show at ACUS HQ while I participate virtually due to unforeseen circumstances. If there was a good way to do a virtual round of applause, Kaja and the rest of our team well deserve it. I'm proud to report that we currently have 13 projects underway directed toward the development of recommendations. These projects will keep committees busy between this spring and next fall. A full list of projects is available on the screen and in your plenary booklet. I'll highlight a few for you today. Committees will consider 4 important projects this spring. The first examines how agencies draft the preambles to proposed and final rules, particularly in light of recent developments in judicial review. The project will identify best practices to help agencies explain how they determine their legal authority, evaluate rulemaking records, and reach policy decisions. Professor Daniel Deacon from the University of Michigan Law School is serving as consultant for that project. The second project examines how agencies communicate with each other throughout the rulemaking process, especially outside the formal OIRA-administered interagency review process. Professor Christopher Kerrigan, co-director of GW's Regulatory Studies Center, is serving as consultant for the project. The third project examines how agencies use MOUs, Memoranda of Understanding, and similar arrangements to coordinate with other agencies that operate in shared regulatory spaces. This actually builds on a project that ACUS undertook about a decade ago. Professor Blaine Saito from the University of Ohio Moritz College of Law is serving as consultant for the project. And the fourth project focuses on monthly monetary benefit programs. It will examine how agency procedures for processing favorable claims decisions and delivering benefits to beneficiaries accurately, consistently, and on time. ACUS attorney advisor Leah Robbins is serving as in-house researcher for this project. Permitting is obviously in the public discourse, and I'm excited to share that 3 great projects are underway to examine agency licensing and permitting processes in greater depth. The first project examines when and how agencies use general permits and permits by rule. We have a fantastic consultant team, including several CEQ alumni. They are Professors David Edelman, Justin Pito, Jamie Plune, and John Rupel. The second project examines what information agencies make available about pending license and permit applications and how they do so. It will identify best practices to help agencies collect and disclose information about the status of pending applications to promote efficiency, accuracy, transparency, and accountability. This builds on work not only in the federal government, but also in many states, including most recently in Virginia. Sam Rowland and Tamis Hockman from the Foundation for American Innovation are serving as consultants for the project. And the third project examines how the federal government provides information about licenses and permits and helps regulated entities identify and apply for the licenses and permits that are relevant to their situations. Professor Dave Owen from the UC Law San Francisco is serving as the consultant for the project. ACUS has issued several important recommendations on agencies' use, development, and publication of guidance documents. 2 ongoing projects carry that work forward. The first examines when agencies issue regulatory warnings and how they do so. Aaron Nielsen, well known to most of you, is serving as consultant. And the second project examines how agencies develop, use, and publish legal explainers. Consultants for the project are Professors Joshua Blank and Leo Sofsky, who previously consulted for ACUS on automated legal guidance. Finally, ACUS continues to identify best practices to help agencies manage adjudication programs, particularly high-volume programs, more effectively. One project will examine the frontline pre-hearing processes that agencies use initially to decide applications for benefits, loans, grants, and licenses. This will add to our growing body of recommendations that investigate many different formats for adjudication, including those that involve an evidentiary hearing, appeals, and proceedings that involve no evidentiary hearing whatsoever. Professor Amy Widman is serving as consultant for that project. She comes to us from Rutgers Law School and should be well known to the conference, having consulted twice before on non-lawyer representation and assistance and on administrative burdens. Another project examines in depth how agencies collect and use data about their adjudication programs to evaluate and improve quality, timeliness, fairness, and efficiency. This project builds on several recent recommendations, including one you'll consider next. Other projects underway examine statements of agency organization, how agencies use, produce, and publish them, as well as regional offices at regulatory agencies. There's more information about these and other projects in the booklet and on our website. If you're interested in learning more about any projects, please reach out. And we're always on the lookout for ideas for new projects. So please be in touch if you come across anything in the course of your work that you think might benefit from action by ACUS. And with that, Ron, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And thank you first for participating while out sick today. And second, for the job that you and Kaja and all of our research staff do. Let me ask for unanimous consent to violate a order of business that we already adopted. We are ahead of schedule. And I would like to proceed to the fourth recommendation on our list today, organization management and operation of agency adjudication offices, if there is no objection. Hearing none, we are changing our order of business by unanimous consent. And let me ask our committee chair, Nadine Mancini, our Jennifer Coe, who is our consultant, and staff counsel, Robbins, to tee this one up. Let me start first from Jennifer on the report and then Nadine on the committee's proceedings.
Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Coe. I'm a law professor at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law in Malibu, California, and I'll just very briefly describe the report, which studies the organization, management, and operation of agency adjudication offices. The focus is on offices that provide hearings, either through ALJs or administrative judges, or that conduct appellate review of such hearings. Various ACUS reports have considered aspects of these issues, but ACUS has not directly addressed these questions for about 30 years. And so the report's findings are based on case studies of 9 agencies reflecting 15 different adjudication offices, many but not all with both hearing and appellate level review. And in addition to publicly available information, we conducted 17 interviews to support the case studies, mostly with current agency officials. These agencies and offices reflect considerable variation in size, the degree to which adjudication is central to the broader agency, the existence of appellate review bodies, and the discreteness or variation in the subject matter addressed. And ultimately, the report explores how the nature of a broader agency impacts where an adjudication office fits into that agency's overall hierarchy, the internal structure of adjudication offices, who the management officials are, in particular the role of chairs and chief ALJs and chief judges, the range of management tools used in those offices, as well as resources and operational aspects of adjudication. So given the variation that exists even across the 9 agency studies, the recommendations encourage agencies to engage in evidence-based evaluations of their organizational, management, and operational practices and gather data to then act based on that data and evidence that is specific to each agency, but with the broader goals of transparency, efficiency, fairness, and quality in decision making. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me turn to Nadine next for any discussion of the proceedings before the committee or any general comments.
Thanks, Ron. I just wanted to start by thanking Jennifer for a really fabulous report on what I found to be a really interesting topic, and for her assistance throughout the committee process. And I want to thank Leah Robbins for all of her hard work. She knows exactly when to step in to assist the committee in our deliberations. Thanks to the entire ACUS team for supporting us every step of the way and consistently producing high quality work product. And finally, my fellow committee members, I see you, you know who you are. Your dedication to this work always impresses me. And I thank you for your expertise and thoughtful input. I will be brief. We met twice this fall, a long time ago before the shutdown, which feels like forever ago. So I'll just start by saying I think it's fair to say that we found this project to be a nice sort of shift from the usual type of project that we take up, in that the recommendation takes a straightforward nuts and bolts approach to an important topic that I suspect many agencies don't always study or consider in great depth. The committee fully recognized that agency adjudication programs and then their offices are vastly different in structure, management, and operation. So with that in mind, our discussion focused on identifying the important data points from a broad perspective that agencies should track to inform the decisions they make about how to organize and structure their adjudication offices in a way that fits their specific scheme. The committee also considered the different types of management duties and roles for adjudication office personnel, and what factors agencies should consider in making decisions about how to develop those roles and assign those duties. Finally, not surprisingly, the committee found real value in leaning on other ACUS recommendations that indirectly touch upon this topic. And those other recommendations really help to round out the practical considerations for agencies when making decisions about how to structure and manage their adjudication offices. So I will look forward to hearing from everyone, and I turn things back to Ron. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you, Jennifer. I will say that Nadine and her committee have been pressed into service repeatedly, and we are considering doubling her pay as committee chair for the coming year. Our first order of business is the manager's amendments, and as usual, these consist of non-substantive revisions. They're highlighted in yellow on the red line recommendation in your materials. Is there any objection to adopting the manager's amendments? Hearing no objection, these are adopted. And before we begin consideration of pre-submitted amendments, does any member seek recognition for the purpose of general discussion on this recommendation? Seeing none, we'll proceed to the consideration of amendments proposed by the council. We have 2 council proposed amendments as recommendation. The first would add language to line 69 in recognition of the fact that data collection needs may vary across agencies. The data collection practices that are identified in paragraph 1 may be of particular relevance to agencies that administer high volume adjudication programs, and perhaps less important to agencies that decide relatively few cases. Nadine, let me ask, do you on behalf of the committee have any particular concerns about this change?
No, it's not something that we really focused on. I think we were thinking that agencies would adapt a lot of these factors to the best of their ability in terms of their programs. And even if it's data for a small volume, maybe that's easier to gather. But I think highlighting this point seems fine. But it would be great if Jennifer had any thoughts to round out the addition of that language.
Jen?
I agree with that. I mean, just to say that, obviously smaller agencies could also benefit from the collection of data, especially to the extent that there are personnel changes, and smaller agencies are generally in a practice of relying on sort of personal memory of longtime players. That kind of data collection I could see being helpful.
Are there any objections from the members? Hearing none, I'll ask for unanimous consent. First council amendment is adopted. The second council proposed amendment would add language to paragraph 7 at line 145 so that it recommends that heads of agents of adjudication offices should report directly to the agency head or deputy agency head as appropriate unless a statute provides otherwise, or such a reporting structure would adversely affect the integrity of agency adjudications. Nadine, is there anything you want to say regarding committee deliberations on this?
This is one that we did discuss, and the language, the unless phrase there was something that we felt would help kind of address any situations where setting up a structure like this would be problematic. That said, I don't think it hurts to have a well-placed as appropriate. I think that still aligns with how we viewed this recommendation.
Thank you. Any reaction, Jen, on your standpoint?
No, I mean, I agree with what Nadine said. I think from my perspective, I was thinking about a situation in which there's a large-scale agency reorganization. And then, for example, if the head of an adjudication is placed in a position that could be subordinate to an office that is explicitly focused on enforcement or fraud prevention, those kinds of situations would obviously be concerning, but definitely agree with the spirit of what Nadine noted.
Is there any discussion from the floor? Hearing none, let me ask for unanimous consent to this amendment. It is adopted. There are no pre-submitted amendments from members on this recommendation. So let me ask if there are any recommendations from the floor. There being no upswell of recommendations from the floor, says to me that the consultant and the committee did a great job on this. Is there any objection to adopting this amendment? Hearing none, I will say we have unanimous consent to that. And at this point, I think we have nothing further that we can take up before the lunch break. So we will move forward to the lunch break and come back at 12:30 Eastern Time. Thank you. We were early today. Welcome back. I hope everyone had a good lunch. Our third recommendation of the day, federal agency collaboration with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, which comes to us from the Committee on Regulation. And I'd like to thank Helen Seracio, Committee Chair, consultants Jennifer Celine and Pamela McCann, and staff counsel Bakaja Caldwell for all of their work on this project. We'll hear first from Jennifer on the report, and then from Helen on the committee's proceedings. Jennifer?
Thanks. So we began this report with the idea that federal administration regularly requires federal agencies to interact with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, which in the report we call SLTTGs. And in fact, today, over 80% of federal statutes that are passed by Congress include provisions that contemplate partnerships between federal agencies and SLTTGs. And so when we began this project, we quickly realized two things. First, there wasn't a source that catalogs all of these different statutes that provide for the partnerships. And that's problematic because we had really no idea of the frequency of requirements for partnerships or how those partnerships are distributed across the executive branch. And then second, in doing our preliminary research, we realized that regardless of field, whether you look at law, political science, public administration, the majority of those who study partnerships between federal agencies and SLTTGs neglect to uncover the day-to-day interactions between partners as they work together to administer federal programs. And that's important because if we're trying to think about best practices, we need to know what goes on a day-to-day basis. And so in our report, we tried to do both of these things. Our research design included both quantitative and qualitative methods. Specifically, we performed text analysis of the 2025 US Code and analyzed over 3.7 million sentences that contemplate partnerships between federal agencies and SLTTGs. And then our qualitative research included a survey of federal administrators, interviews and listening sessions with federal administrators, and a wide array of interested persons from both within and outside of government, and a request for information that AIC is published in the Federal Register. So here's what we found. Statutory law actually requires most agencies to interact with SLTTG partners in varying ways. And what's really important for us to keep in mind as we're debating the recommendation is that federal agencies balance dozens, if not hundreds, of these partnerships at any given moment in time. And this presents some overall challenges to agencies as they work on their partnerships. First, the partners and federal agencies come to the table with some misunderstandings about their roles and about the partnerships before they even begin to work together. Then, as a result of those misunderstandings, there are real frustrations that inform the partners' initial programmatic discussions. And then those frustrations then trickle down to the dynamics of the day-to-day working relationships between federal agencies and their partners. And so taking both statutory frameworks and the challenges that agencies face into account, we identified some commonalities that exist across all successful partnerships, even if those partnerships involve vastly different federal agencies, partners, or policies. And they are that federal agencies really need to work with SLTTGs to bridge different perspectives that they have on the law and the programs that they're administering. They need to define common objectives for their partnerships and plan strategically to achieve those objectives. They need to clarify their leadership responsibilities and sustain identified points of contact, establish mechanisms that hold partners accountable for their performance, utilize and update formal agreements to structure the partnerships themselves, and employ and update technology after a full assessment of the opportunities and risks of doing so. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you. Helen, comments on the report, on the recommendation on the committee deliberations?
Great, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Jennifer and Pam for their tremendous work they did on the report. It was highly researched. It has a lot of great information in it. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I recommend that you do. So, and they were also skillfully, provided great insight as we met for our meetings. I want to thank Bakaja, who helped navigate us through this process. She is tremendous at what she does, and we couldn't get here without her. And of course, we wouldn't be here without my committee members, who always comes enthusiastic for our meetings and provides great ideas to make our recommendations even stronger. We had 2 meetings on our recommendations. The last one was in December. And as you will note from looking at the recommendation, really what this is focused on, you'll remember in recommendation 2025-2, the conference identified best practices for consulting with state, local, and tribal governments in the regulatory process policy making. This recommendation looks broader than that. It looks at like the full array of different types of actions and activities that agencies engage in with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. And when we were working on this, I think that the goal with the committee was really making sure that the recommendations in here were clear, useful, and something that implementable by agencies, recognizing the fact that there's a lot of different structures for agencies and a lot of different statutory authorities and different types of partnerships that they might have with these entities. And so a lot of our time was spent discussing, just making sure that the way that things were structured in here would be useful, easy to understand, and transferable for for the variety of different agencies involved. I don't want to take up too much other time because we can get to the heart of the matter, but really I think that the committee that with that focus on it, the end result is the tremendous recommendation you see in front of you. So we can turn to that.
Thank you very much. Our first order of business is managers' amendments. As usual, these are non-substantive revisions. They're highlighted in yellow on the red line recommendation in your plenary packets. Is there any objection to adopting the manager's amendments? Hearing none, are these adopted by unanimous consent? We have adopted them. Before we begin consideration of pre-submitted amendments, does any member seek recognition for the purpose of general discussion of the recommendation? Okay, so Abby Gluck.
Thank you so much. So I'm having some technical problems today. I apologize. I had just a general comment about the recommendation. Is it appropriate to make a comment about part of the recommendation that's not visible on the screen right now?
You can make a general comment about the recommendation. If you want to focus on a particular area, we should wait till we get to that area. But
okay, then I'll wait because mine is a general comment about the very end of it. So I'll just hold my comment till then.
Okay. Are there any other general comments people want to make? So we're going to go to particular amendments. Let's take up the title first. The Committee on Regulation voted to change the title of the recommendation from federal agency collaboration with state, local, tribal, territorial governments to federal agency collaboration. I'm not going to say that one again. With state, tribal, local, and territorial governments. And while this messes up the acronym, the committee thought that it did a better job of getting things in the proper order in terms of the hierarchy. Is there any discussion on the title? I would ask for unanimous consent then. And hearing no objection, we have that. We don't have any proposed council amendments, so we're going to proceed to the pre-submitted conference member amendments. And let me start with Jeff Luthers. Jeff's proposed to amend language at paragraph 15, line 155 of the clean version of the recommendation to include national organizations that represent state, state, I'm gonna get the STLTG. So I'll just go with the acronym, so as to be consistent with the identical in paragraph 9. Helen, is this consistent or contrary to the committee's intent?
I don't think this would be contrary to the committee's intent because it's groups that represent the STLTGs, which is what we were aiming at. So,
is there any comment or discussion from the floor? Since Jeff is a non-voting member, we'll need this to be moved by a voting member. Does someone want to move this on Jeff's behalf?
I can move this, Caroline.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there any discussion? Any objection? If not, we will adopt by unanimous consent. Okay. That takes care of all the pre-submitted amendments. Are there floor amendments or comments? Let me go back. Abby, did you want to intervene at this point?
Yeah, sure. If you're able to scroll to the very end, the part of the recommendation that's about the transparent, this right here, perfect, public availability. I think in actual practice, there are some instances in which it's helpful for federal agencies and the state and local counterparts to not be as transparent about their interactions. Sometimes they're working behind the scenes to collaborate, and sometimes they're working across party lines in ways that are helpful, but are not helpful for them to broadcast on websites. So I'm just wondering about this. Should this sort of always put everything out in the public recommendation as opposed to something like should as appropriate? While I recognize that there may be a desire for transparency, I think in actual practice, often there are moments where it's not helpful. I mean, I can give an example if it's helpful. So it's now been well documented that in the context of the Affordable Care Act implementation under President Obama, there were many state health departments that were in Republican-led states that were interested in implementing the statute and making their insurance markets work. But politically, it was difficult for that to be a publicly recognized endeavor, but it was very helpful to the states themselves. And there's been research, including my own, that documented that those interactions were very valued. And I'm sure that that's not the only example of a cooperative federalism statute in which it's helpful to have some cross-state federal collaboration that's not necessarily broadcast to the world. So just recognizing the norm of transparency that's highly valued, I just wanted to flag that issue. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Any formal motion? I think we also had some managers amendments. So we've taken account of any other amendments that people want to recommend. So we have the title change and the manager's amendments. And if no one else has recommendations to make or propose changes, we can move to the adoption of the recommendations. Jeff, did you have an issue to raise?
Yes. This is, I'm trying to find it now. On the, well, it was originally relating to providing funding opportunities, which committee already accepted my reordering, but yeah, providing funding opportunities. I was wondering whether we should say provide funding opportunities when allowed by law. Now, I realize that this is normally implied and understood, but when we're talking about federal officials giving out money, I think we should maybe be a little more clear that it has to be allowed by law here. And so my proposal was to just add when allowed by law there. It may not be necessary, but I just wanted to raise it for others to consider.
Let me ask Helen for a reaction on behalf of the committee.
As you said, Jeff, that it's inherent in there that agencies would understand that they can only do things that are within the bounds of the law. So I don't think it's necessary, but if anyone feels differently that we want to clarify that more, please feel free to raise your hand and speak.
Is there a proposal from any voting member to do that?
Not so far.
Hearing none, we will assume that the spirit of Jeff's idea is already in the report. Well, thank you, Jeff, for noting it.
Okay.
Are there other proposed amendments to this recommendation? If not, we're prepared to proceed to a vote on the recommendation as a whole. Is there any objection to the adoption of the recommendation? Not, we will declare it having been adopted by unanimous consent. And that brings us to the end of the plenary. When I became dean of a law school, one of the things the development office wanted me to do was to learn to play golf, which they thought would be helpful to fundraising. And it turns out that all of our first in the school's history major gifts were arrived at on the golf course. And it was only later that I found out they would have been double if I'd stopped playing halfway through. Although I did have delusions of mediocrity as a golfer. This plenary session, however, has run efficiently and smoothly. And in terms of our timeline, we are ending about halfway through. I want to thank all of the members of the staff for their hard work and devotion to putting things like this together and working on behalf of the conference in between all of our plenary sessions. I want to thank as well all the committee chairs and consultants for their work. I want to thank our research staff in particular for all the work in putting this together. And I want to note that our next plenary is scheduled for June 11th, 2026. Between now and then, I wish all of you good luck, good weather, and good times. And we are now formally adjourning the 84th plenary session.